Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of He's Not Wrong, and I'm your host, Chad D. Okay, so first off, I have to address the elephant in the room. My voice sounds off because I'm sick. I came down with whatever crap is going around this country right now, and it is settling in my lungs. So I apologize for that, but you know what? Regardless if I'm sick or not, the show must go on. I'm not canceling episodes or rearranging anything because I feel a little under the weather. So I apologize. My stubbornness is why you're going to have to listen to me sound a little congested on this episode. Before we get into the episode, I just want to remind everyone to please leave a review. Please leave us some stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you're listening. Your reviews, your ratings help us tremendously with reaching new listeners. So it's really important that before we get into this episode that you just take a moment to go onto whatever app you're listening to us on and leave that review, leave that rating, help out He's Not Wrong. And I appreciate it. We also are collecting emails for an announcement regarding Substack coming here in the next few days. So please go to he'snotwrongpodcast.com. At the bottom of the page, you can enter your email and I'll transfer that email over to our Substack page. Like I said, stay tuned for an announcement on what 2026 is going to look like here in the next couple of days. So that being said, today's conversation is about public safety, immigration, and the growing gap between why Americans are being told to fear those who look different from us and what the data actually shows about crime in our communities. It's about how political narratives are manufactured and how fear is weaponized and how those narratives shape real policy decisions that affect real people. My guest today is Insha Rahman, Vice President of Advocacy at the Vera Institute of Justice and Director of Vera Action. Her work sits at the intersection of criminal justice reform, immigration policy, and public safety, with a focus on evidence-based solutions that actually make communities safer. We talk about how crime and immigration have been deliberately linked in political rhetoric, despite data showing that crime rates are declining and that most people targeted by immigration enforcement have no criminal convictions. We unpack the lack of accountability within ICE, the human cost of immigration enforcement on families and communities, and why the public conversation so often ignores those realities. We dig into power and federal overreach. We discuss the Supreme Court's recent ruling limiting the president's ability to deploy the National Guard and why that decision matters and why it's not the end of the story. Insha explains what this moment signals about executive power, the potential use of the Insurrection Act, and why vigilance is still required. And so with that being said, I will hold off no longer on giving you my conversation with Insha Rahman. Insha, welcome to He's Not Wrong. I am so grateful that you're here with us today. How are you doing? How's your holiday season been?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing well, Chad, and it's great to be here. How's your holiday been?
It's been good, except for health-wise, coming down with whatever's been spreading across the country. I've fallen prey, so I apologize to the listeners for the bassiness in my voice if that's how they're listening to this podcast episode in their car. I know I'm probably blowing out their eardrums right now.
It's a little more gravitas for our conversation. How about that?
Right. That's a perfect way to look at it. So you are the Vice President of Advocacy at the Vera Institute, and you're the Director of Vera Action. And before we get into the news of the moment that I wanted to talk to you about, I want to ground the conversation in the work that you do every day, because as the Vice President of Advocacy, as the Director of Vera Action, your work focuses on crime, public safety, immigration policy. So for the listeners who might not be familiar with the Vera Institute, how would you describe your work and the mission behind it?
So Vera is a 60-year-old national organization. We're based in New York City, but work across the country nationally and have offices in DC, New Orleans, LA. And our work is to end mass incarceration, fight for immigrants' rights, and help build safe, thriving communities. And we do that by partnering with government and communities across the country to find the toughest problems in our criminal justice and immigration systems and actually pilot, test, and scale the solutions that work. So we do a lot of work on the ground. We pass policy. We write a lot of research reports. A lot of folks who say, oh, I know Vera, it's because they've read a research report or seen a site of ours. But we really, I think of ourselves as a place that not only puts out ideas into the world, but actually tries them out and shows this is what works and this is what doesn't. And I'd say the the big sort of lesson learned from our 60 plus years of doing this is the way that this country attacks the very real problem of crime and public safety is just flawed, and there are better ways to do it. And so that really sort of opens up the conversation we're about to have on both the criminal justice and the immigration side.
Looking at the work that you're doing when it comes to making communities safer, I appreciate the fact that your work is grounded in evidence, it's grounded in data. But something that I think is a big miss on a lot of people is the fact that they just think of community safety through the lens of their local news or through what they hear coming out of the White House in press briefings. And there's so much that is missed when it comes to solutions and problem solving. So for the people who aren't looking at the research reports, who aren't looking at the actual data behind what makes communities truly safer, for one another, what is being misunderstood or misrepresented in the national conversation right now?
Well, people don't judge their sense of whether or not I feel safe, whether or not crime is going up or down based on the statistics. Most people couldn't tell you what the stats are, but they can give you a feeling of, I think crime is going up, I think crime is going down, here's what I think is working, here's what I think isn't. And that's something that I would say folks who are working on reform often miss, is that evidence and data is so important to actually move policy and practice, but you have to bring people along and speak to people's very valid desire to be safe. And so often the political conversation is divorced from the reality of what's happening on the ground. And the political conversation is driven by politicians who have huge platforms and unfortunately often fearmonger and weaponize crime as a political issue as opposed to having a real debate about the evidence and policy that works. And then the politics of crime really comes out in the nightly news, what folks watch on TV every night or see on TikTok or read in the headlines. And again, that's not grounded in reality necessarily. It's grounded in the sort of sensational sort of like incident that happened today, this week, this month. And so what's missing for folks? One is an honest debate about what actually works to prevent crime and break its cycle. Every time a horrendous, tragic incident occurs, what's the response that we see? We need to crack down on crime. We need tougher sentences. We need harsher laws. And we've done that in this country for 50, 60 years. It has driven the rise of mass incarceration. And we are an outlier compared to our Western, peers like Canada or England or France or Germany, in that we both have more people locked up and incarcerated, and we have higher rates of crime. Clearly what we are doing is not working. And so that's where I think there's an opening, because everyday people, and I do a lot of work on the political side of polling and public opinion research on what people think actually drives crime, what people think works to make our communities safe. And where the political debate is about this sort of tough versus soft on crime and where are you on that spectrum, it's actually missing where voters are. Voters understand, first of all, we need to invest in the things that prevent crime in the first place. And they fully understand that things like investing in education, affordable housing, green spaces, healthcare, mental health, and drug treatment are actually really important factors that prevent crime before it happens instead of just reacting after. They think there is an important role for police, but police should be focused on responding to and solving the most serious crimes, not being used to sort of be a patch over for the failing social safety net.
Yeah.
And people also understand that the way that we break the cycle of crime is to send the right first responders. So instead of having police respond to a mental health crisis call, for example, or doing traffic enforcement, we need to actually send trained civilian experts to do those things so we can free up the police to focus on the most serious crimes. That's the formula that works. That's certainly not part of the political debate that we hear. And it's a disservice to the American people, because then we gloss over the policies and the solutions that work to have the political debate that frankly serves none of us.
I'm baffled right now because how can voters understand that these things are needed and necessary in order to make our community safer, but yet they voted for someone who just doesn't represent those ideals or speak about the actual things that can bring tangible results to our communities to make them safer? Like, where are there any points in your research or in the data that points to why voters can understand the issue, but then vote against their better interest when it comes to this topic? Like, how, I
Yeah.
don't understand how that
Yeah.
disconnect is there.
Yeah. And we're talking, Chad, about people who voted for Trump last year, right?
Yeah.
Or folks who continue to vote for politicians who sort of, espouse a tough on crime platform. Part of the challenge has been people think of being safe as a kitchen table issue, much in the way that we want to put food on the table, have a roof over our heads, provide for our families, not feel like we have to work three jobs just to get by.
Hmm.
People want it to feel natural and obvious and easy that when I go outside, I am safe. When my kids go play, they go to school, they won't be the victim of a mass shooting, that I can get around my community and feel safe. So it's a kitchen table issue. And what Republicans and Trump in particular has cynically done brilliantly is tap into that fear, much in the way that Trump did the same on the economy, right? Like what he is a master of cynically is being a good diagnostician of the fears and the concerns that everyday Americans have. All of his answers and his solutions are the wrong ones. And that's what we are seeing now
Yeah.
sit here at the end of 2025. But if you look on the campaign trail, and we actually did some research on this, Trump and the GOP last year in the 2024 election cycle, they spent over $1 billion talking about crime and public safety, both in terms of migrant crime, criminals coming across the border, blue cities, and crime out of control. How much did the Democrats talk about it? Well, we have a number. They spent about 319 million talking about this, sort of compared to over $1 billion by the GOP. And importantly, when they talked about it, it was mostly to say, I too am tough on crime. It was this race to the bottom of who could be tougher on crime, who could be tougher on the border, who could say, I'm going to crack down, I'm the top cop. And that's what Kamala Harris ran on. And what we saw in our research at the end of last year is that actually didn't sway voters. It didn't sway Republican voters who were like, I actually like the tough on crime. If I'm going to vote for anything, I'm going to vote for the real McCoy. And it didn't sway Democratic voters or independents who are like, I've heard this tough on crime rhetoric before. You sound GOP light, you sound insincere.
Yeah.
And frankly, I don't think getting tough on crime is the solution that works. I actually think we need a new paradigm for safety. And that is, Chad, where we started this conversation
Yeah.
about where everyday voters are and what they understand actually works to prevent crime and break its cycle.
So, with what we know, with what the polling says, we know crime rates are down across all of America. So, before we dive into the Supreme Court and everything else I want to talk about, I want to use this as a framing question. So, from where you sit, is there a genuine, true public safety crisis, or are we just living through a crisis on how public safety is being framed and weaponized?
I think there is a crisis of confidence in whether this government can deliver on the basic kitchen table issues that Americans care about. We talk about this a lot when it comes to the economy and cost of living and affordability. We don't talk about it nearly enough when it comes to making our communities safe. That's where the crisis of confidence is. You are completely right that crime rates are going down across the country. In fact, at the end of 2025, we will have seen some of the lowest murder rates in this country in decades. And that is the hard work of mayors across this country because they represent their local constituents. They are on the ground more than any other elected leader. And they're the ones who both see the problems with crime and are closest to the solutions that actually work. And we are watching crime rates drop in places like Chicago, Baltimore, here in New York City, which is where I'm based, LA, and everywhere in between. And so it's not that we don't know what works. We do. We don't talk about enough what works. We've let, again, the political debate about crime dominate the policy one that voters actually want to hear. And we actually have examples in communities across the country, and I'll point out two, Detroit and Baltimore, where we've watched crime decline tremendously. Like both Baltimore and Detroit are on track to have some of the lowest crime rates in decades. Detroit last year had the lowest number of shootings and homicides in 57 years since they started keeping track. Like, wow. And what we've actually watched is local leaders have those conversations and say, here's what worked. This victim services program, this hospital-based community violence intervention program, this youth mentoring program. They also talked about how they deployed police to quickly respond when somebody calls 911. So people aren't waiting hours, but in fact, they get a response within minutes. And police are focused on solving the most serious crimes. Those are the kinds of conversations that we're watching happening at the very local level. And Baltimore and Detroit are two really good examples of this. That's where both Democrats and Republicans, if they want to get ahead on this issue, if they want to win over voters on a highly politicized issue, they should be looking to cities that are actually getting this right. And so I say this to offer a glimmer of hope here, which is I think we can, in fact, turn the corner on this confidence crisis. And we got to look to the cities and the mayors and the elected leaders and local organizers and advocates and practitioners who are doing this right.
I mean, you stole the thunder right out from under me, because there's two questions that no, don't apologize. I love it, because there's two questions that I love to ask each of my guests, and that's what gives you hope, and then how to get involved in the community. And we haven't really gotten into community involvement yet. We will later in the episode. I've said it for like the past 3 episodes. There's 2 storylines to the podcast. I'm not wrong, obviously, number one. And then number 2 is how important it is to get involved at the local community level. And with what you just said shows so much about what we have within ourselves power-wise with our vote at the local level, getting involved, that when you vote for a mayor who understands these things, when you vote for a city council that understands these things, you can move the needle on something that has a very dark and negative political national talking point attached to it. But you can change that narrative at the local level to where it benefits you, and you can feel it almost immediately. And so I really appreciate you talking about that, because it cannot be stated enough just how important it is to get involved in your local community, to understand what your elected officials at the local level are doing. And no, I'm so happy you brought that up.
Yeah. Chad, I often, so I've been listening to some of your episodes in preparation for coming on, and I love that. I'm not wrong, but it's also like, you're so right that the way that people can feel like they see change and they can make change is at the local level. And that really has impact at the national level too. At the end of the day, this country is made up of 3,000 counties in 50 states by, over 300 million people. All of us who have agency to change the course of what is happening in our country. And I actually feel very, very hopeful sitting here at the end of 2025 that in the next year we can see real change happen, and we are going to be responsible for it.
I am hopeful that it can happen as well, especially with how we're seeing the elections that have played out in the past few months turn out. Like people are aware, they know what's going on, and I love that they're taking action, and we're seeing midterm level turnout in special elections. That doesn't happen.
No, people are pissed and they're energized, and like that is a great combination.
I was about to say that's the perfect combo.
Yeah,
perfect combo for getting action. So I want to discuss now how we got here, because it feels like where we are right now with ICE activity, with the National Guard deployments, that it's been a long time in the making. And I remember when Biden was office, I think this was about a year ago, he worked with Congress on bipartisan immigration and border legislation that pretty much addressed a lot of the issues that both parties saw as top priorities that we were talking about when it comes to crime and immigration. Trump stepped in, he killed the bill. And at that time, a lot of people just thought it was simply about denying Biden a political win. And it obviously was a bit deeper than that. But looking at what's happening now, it's very clear that that bill would have also limited Trump's ability to justify what he's doing now. And I know there in Project 2025, they laid out how he would use a National Guard, how he would use ICE. And so we knew what the plan was, and that bill would have effectively stopped that plan from going into action. So what I'm curious about from your perspective is, was the groundwork for the moment that we're in now laid well before that, or was that the first clear point where we could see how serious Trump was about immigration enforcement and being this aggressive with it?
After Biden won in 2020, Democrats missed an opportunity to take on immigration as a comprehensive issue. What they should have done and made a priority in 2021 when Democrats had the upper hand because they had not only the House and the Senate, but also the presidency, they should have pushed for comprehensive immigration reform, which means two things. One is to have a secure, fair, and orderly process at the border, and to make sure there is a pathway to legalization and citizenship for people who are here. And the bipartisan bill, negotiated by Senators Lankford and Sinema, that had a fair amount of bipartisan support, including support from Biden, I frankly think was too little, too late, because it only focused on the border security aspect and not in ways that actually would have fundamentally solved the problem that had been building over many, many years. And so I don't know that I think that that was necessarily the bill that should have moved forward. I think the Biden administration missed an opportunity to address this issue much earlier on and before it became the crisis of busing, migrants to cities, sort of putting this issue on everyone's doorstep before the problem of fentanyl just surged. And the GOP, again, cynically but effectively sort of said, all of these problems you are seeing, higher cost of living, the opioid and fentanyl crisis, the feeling of not being able to get by, it's all because of this surge of immigration at the border. And by 2024, June of 2024, when the Lankford-Sinema bill was being negotiated and Trump came in to torpedo it, it was already too late in terms of public opinion on immigration in a way that the Biden-Harris administration would have had a lot more public support if they had leaned into this issue back in 2021 when they first had power. And so that is, I think, a warning for Democrats. There is a lot of enthusiasm and hope that Democrats will certainly have some important victories in 2026, win the House, maybe even win the Senate and be a check on Trump. They should also be planning for what should we do on public safety, on crime, and immigration, because those issues are really closely linked in the public imagination for a whole host of reasons we can unpack. But that should actually be one of the first things that Democrats say, we're going to have a new paradigm for safety, stability, and security, both in terms of how we do crime and public safety, as well as how we do immigration, because the American people are owed something better than the status quo.
I fully agree. When that bill was being proposed, it really did feel like something feels off. The timing felt off. It felt very rushed. Like it didn't have a genuine, we care about this policy because it's in the best interest of Americans. We care about it because it's politically advantageous for us to do it before the next election. And that is a big disconnect with voters, I believe. And you just back that up. And but I do want to unpack that link between crime and immigration. I know you just said it's linked for a whole host of reasons, but what is that link? Why is it linked? I know we talked about it with fear. They're using fear in politics to link it, but I want to unpack that a little bit if we can.
Well, for so long, the issues of both crime and border security feel like, twin sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And in the past several years, we have watched a whole lot of fear-mongering and anti-immigrant sentiment sort of like wrapped up in crime, right? When you think about 2024, what was the most frequent line of attack by Trump and the GOP? It was migrant crime, open borders, and that was really about tapping into the fear that people have of being safe, and sort of giving people who were rightly feeling like things are not going well. I don't know why I can't afford to make ends meet. I'm working harder than I ever have before, and life feels less attainable. And the GOP did, again, a cynical but brilliant job of giving people an answer. And they said it was immigrants. It's immigrants that are taking our housing, taking your jobs, taking your health care, taking your benefits, and they're not putting everyday Americans first. That's the problem with Democrats. What did Democrats say in response? either nothing or to say, well, I too will crack down on crime, or I too will crack down on the border. And in those ways, sort of the issues of crime and immigration became synonymous. They became one and the same. And this is something that we can literally track over the past 10 years of Trump and his entry into American politics. And you see that linkage get closer and closer and closer. Obviously, there are deeper roots in this. Back in the 1920s, when America passed the first of its very, very restrictive immigration policies, it was the exact same language that you hear today. These are immigrants, they're migrant rapists and insane people the other countries are giving us. They're like, they're emptying their jails, their prisons, their asylums, and that's who they're sending us. We've heard this rhetoric before. It's existed for over a century, that nativist, bigoted rhetoric, and we're just seeing a resurgence of it. And again, there are many different precedents in time for this, 9/11 and what we saw after 9/11 in terms of a tightening of national security. And, one of the things people often say, well, like, why should we be that worried about immigrants and foreign-born people in this country? Because even today, when we have immigration levels at some of the highest that they have ever been in this country, less than 15% of Americans are in fact foreign-born. But the reason that we should all care whether or not we were born in this country is because what this country and the government does to immigrants in terms of surveillance, in terms of running roughshod over constitutional protections, in terms of, sort of squeezing and pushing them to the margins. When it happens to immigrants, it will next happen to someone else and someone else and someone else, and eventually it will come to you, which is why it matters to stand up. And again, to the point of hope, Chad, we're actually seeing that at the local level as we have watched the National Guard be deployed to cities over the past year. We've watched immigration enforcement ramp up across the country. We're watching everyday people, including a lot of people who are like, I'm not an immigrant, but I see what is happening to my immigrant neighbor, and I'm very afraid for them, and I'm very afraid for me. That is exactly the right reaction to have.
Speaking of the National Guard being deployed in cities across the country, we just saw last week, or the week before, we just recently saw, how about we say that? We just recently saw that the Supreme Court blocked Trump from deploying the National Guard in Illinois, which I think is pretty notable given how supportive they have been to his policies and executive orders so far in this term. So can you explain what that ruling actually reinforces when it comes to this idea of limits on federal power being placed within states?
As much as we feel like what is time in these moments, you are absolutely right that it was just last week. It was on December 23rd that the Supreme Court and its shadow docket, which is its emergency docket, essentially released a very short opinion saying that Trump had not met his burden of proving why he should send the National Guard into Chicago. This is a really important ruling, but I also want to be careful not to overstate that this is like a huge win that has, sort of like will prevent the Trump administration from sending the National Guard or other federal agents into other cities. It's not quite that momentous. So I want to be clear for our listeners that it's a very important ruling, but it's not like, okay, we won, we're done with that problem. We should actually fully expect this administration to maneuver in other ways to try and get around this decision. So here's what the Supreme Court in the emergency docket ruled last week. Essentially, the National Guard can be deployed either by a governor or by the president and the federal government, but only in limited circumstances. And the president is authorized to send the National Guard into a city or a state if one of three conditions are met. There's a danger of invasion by a foreign nation, there's a rebellion or a threat of rebellion, or, and this is the basis that the Trump administration claimed that they can send the National Guard and other federal troops into Chicago, that the president is unable using regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. And basically, the Trump administration said there is a lot of backlash to and attacks on immigration agents in Chicago, and we need to send in the National Guard in order to protect them, and we can't do that in any other way. And this Supreme Court said, actually, Regular forces are not civil law enforcement, the National Guard, or ICE agents, that is the military. You cannot actually claim this power by which to justify sending in the National Guard. That's not a legitimate sort of use of regular forces, or that's not sort of consistent with longstanding sort of federal law about what regular forces are. This is all very complicated, but here's where this comes down to. It means Trump can't send in the National Guard based on the justification that he and his administration have given so far in Chicago. But what they could do, and this is where we need to be careful, is they could say, well, we're going to use the Insurrection Act to actually send in the military into cities. And mind you, this is like, we thought sending the National Guard in was unprecedented. Turns out it's actually not, and I'll get to that in a second. But sending the military into cities across the country is in fact unprecedented. And unfortunately, this Supreme Court decision actually opens the door to say that might be the way that you do this, not through the National Guard, but through the military. And so that's why this decision is both really good for the immediate, but also should get us ready for where is the Trump administration going to go next. And I know legal scholars and other really smart folks are getting ready for those legal challenges if, in fact, Trump uses the Insurrection Act to try and send the military into cities, which, given how much crime is a centerpiece of his authoritarian sort of overreach, I could see that happening in 2026.
That is so interesting to hear you say that, because everyone last week, they were celebrating as if it was the end all be all, that, oh yes, he can't send National Guard in anymore. And there was this almost this energy of, okay, that like we need to be smart here. This is like we're messing with Trump here, that he's one step ahead. And this entire time he's been wanting to use the Insurrection Act, and he's been looking for his reason, the validation, the justification to do so. And so essentially what the Supreme Court did was, handed us an immediate win, but they could have just potentially also handed him a long-term win that he's actually have been wanting to use.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't mean to be too cynical here, because I actually think this is a win. It's absolutely a win, and we should celebrate our wins where we have them. Yep. But we can't just say, ooh, okay, we are done with this horror of sending in federal agents, because we're not. One of the things that we have seen from the numbers is the vast majority of federal agents that are being sent into cities like Chicago, like Boston, like Memphis, LA, and DC are in fact immigration agents. It's ICE, it's Homeland Security investigations. The National Guard is actually a very small slice. So for one thing, it only really applies to how the administration is deploying the National Guard, but not to all the other federal agents that we see, especially the ones who are masked. Those are often ICE agents and immigration agents, not the National Guard. And it also doesn't mean that Trump is done sort of using military force in our cities. He might just find another way to do so. So we need to be smart and sort of anticipate and be ready for the next step, which I firmly believe we are. Again, a moment of hope for me in 2025 is watching how mayors and local electeds, as well as local community advocates, organizers, leaders in the faith community, business communities, have really stepped up to say, not on our watch, to this federal overreach and deployment of federal troops in our cities across the country.
Throughout all of this, there seems to be a missing piece to the story that's being told nationally. I hear it in the conversations that you have, a lot of other podcasters, independent journalists, they're including that human element. And I want to continue to do my part to push it as well, because right now, with the way that the Trump administration is treating and handling individuals, it's almost as if they're trying to put people in this country into classes and into tiers of humanity. And I think that is it's abhorrent. And it's only a matter of time until ICE is in your community. That's what we're seeing. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And we should be thinking about the vulnerable populations and our neighbors who would be impacted. We've talked about this a little bit so far in this episode, but it seems to be almost near impossible to think about ways we can get involved with something that seems so unchecked power wise. It seems that there is no accountability for ICE. So, what can we do as individuals to fight back? With that in mind, what are ways that we as individuals in our local community can be prepared to protect our neighbors, that we can be prepared to fight back? I know we're talking high level so far, but getting into that nitty gritty,
Yeah,
what are the
yes.
tangible things that we can do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start by saying it is so critical that all of us who are listening tell at least 5 people in our lives, here's how you get ready for when ICE shows up, or if ICE is already there in your communities, what can you do? Because the scope and scale of this problem under this administration, it's just enormous. So to put some hard numbers to it, since the beginning of this year, the Trump administration has made about 250,000 immigration arrests. That's 250,000 people. That's bigger than the size of many cities that Americans live in, right? So the scope and scale is enormous. And what we have seen is of those 250,000 people, only about a third actually have criminal convictions. Another third have open pending criminal cases. Another third don't have any kind of criminal convictions at all. And right now, of the more than 60,000 people in immigration detention, less than 7% have a violent conviction. So this
Mm,
whole sort of thing under the guise of crime control and getting rid of the worst, it's simply not borne out by the numbers. And again, it's why I ask people, and this is thing number one that you can do, is when we hear that, well, this is done for crime control, this is for public safety, to say that's absolutely not true. Because if it was, we would go about doing any of this differently. But the sort of like the random, ICE raids on, workplaces, schools, churches, places of worship, that's not going after quote unquote the worst of the worst or actually doing anything for crime control. It is
yeah.
to intimidate and terrorize our community. So that's thing number one that people can do, is actually poke holes in the stated justification of this administration. I think it's really important to do that because this idea of crime control, and again, tapping into people's very valid desire to be safe, it allows us to then let this administration do unconstitutional, illegal things because we're like, well, but it's in the name of public safety. So thing number one is actually having the conversation with people to
Mhm.
say, they say this is about crime control. Here's why it isn't. Here's what the numbers are telling us. Here's what their actions are telling us. The second is to get ready. So what can you do in your community? A number of different cities, especially those led by Democratic mayors and city councils, have actually put out Know Your Rights guides. And I can share links to some. The city of Chicago has put out an incredible set of materials called Protect Chicago, and it's got in it Know Your Rights guides for what can you do when ICE and immigration agents are in your neighborhoods, in your communities. What are your rights? How can you film them? How can you report? What can people who are undocumented or of they don't have legal status, what can they do? And also, what can you call upon your local leaders to do? So there are executive orders that we have seen against cities like LA, Minneapolis, Chicago, a number of others, executive orders that local mayors and city councils and county legislatures have passed to essentially say ICE cannot come stage their immigration raids on city or county property. ICE can't go into these certain sort of sensitive areas like hospitals or courthouses. Those are all things that local folks can call upon their elected leaders to investigate, look into, and pass. And we have seen, again, mayors really step up on this front to say, I'm going to do everything within my executive power to fight back against the executive power and overreach of this federal administration. And third, there are mutual aid networks that we have seen spring up. It's literally WhatsApp and Signal threads, Facebook groups, just great sort of like local community organizing to say, how can we help immigrant parents who are worried about pickup and drop off from school and daycare? How can we go
Mm,
collect their kids so that they are not out and about more than they have to be? How can we run errands and avoid places like even the grocery store or for immigrant workers who are out, sort of vendors on the streets. I've watched communities literally raise money to say, hey, we'll buy all of your vegetables, all of your goods for this week. Stay inside because we know that there are ICE deployments happening right now. There's all kinds of small and big ways that communities are stepping up. Many of us have seen the story of people getting whistles so that they can just start whistling and blowing their whistles and alerting community members of like, hey, I just saw an ICE, truck drive by. So all of those things are so powerful. They have saved lives. They have saved families. And we need to keep that up. And what they also do is make people sort of see with their own eyes what is happening and saying, not in my name. This is not the federal government I voted for. And we're seeing many folks who voted for Trump last year say, this isn't what I meant when I said I wanted a secure border and, to put Americans first. I didn't mean to actually go after our immigrant neighbors and in some cases, not even immigrant neighbors, but US citizens who are being picked up, rounded up in these awful mass enforcement raids.
I love that so much. The idea that I might not have a whole lot of money to donate to an organization, but I have time. I'm going to go to the grocery store no matter what. So how can I help someone out with the things that I'm already going to do in my community to make a difference? I can buy their groceries for them while I'm buying mine to ensure that they're not going out into public longer than they have to be. That is so brilliant. And I don't want to say like help mutual aid is creative, but it is a creative way of thinking that allows people to see themselves helping out other people in their daily lives. Because I think for people who are just now trying to get involved in making a difference in their community because they're very put off by what they're seeing, that there's this idea that you have to have 8 hours a week to volunteer going across town to go to but you don't have to do that. You can literally help someone out by going to your local grocery store when you were planning to go buy your groceries yourself. Like, that is a brilliant way to help someone.
Yeah, I love the simplicity of it. Have the
Yeah.
conversations, like sort of poke holes in the stated justification, call upon your electeds. Not everybody's going to do that, but some will. They want to know, well, what should I ask them for? Ask them to use their power to issue executive orders, to send out know your rights information, to, signal like, here's what we are doing as a city to keep our immigrant neighbors safe.
Mhm.
And to say, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to help with pickup and drop off at the grocery store,
Yep.
mutual aid. And again, as much or as little as people can do. It's actually, I think, again, inspiring and gives us hope to feel like
Yep.
there is something we can do. There's very much something we can do.
Yeah.
And we are watching public opinion shift on these National Guard deployments. So my organization, we did some polling on this back in late September after we saw the deployment of the National Guard, in LA back in June and then in DC in August. And even at that time in late September, sort of like early on in all of this, we saw that the majority of Americans were like, I don't think this is about public safety. I think this is political theater. That has only become more so, where people are like, this isn't helping with crime. This is going after and sort of expanding, again, authoritarian reach and political theater of this administration. And the more that we can keep calling it out, the more that we can have these conversations, the more that we can get everyday people who don't necessarily see themselves as political get involved at the very local level, the more I think we help to shape the national
Mhm.
conversation about what actually works to deliver public safety. It's not this.
You talked a little bit about calling your representatives, local and state leaders, and demanding them to put out more resources, it almost feels like a guardrail, a level accountability. But
Mhm.
right now, it feels, and I know we've talked about this a little bit, but it feels that ICE is just so untouchable that accountability is just not there for them. Is there
Yep.
any real pathway for accountability as it relates to ICE? And if so, like what does accountability look like there for them?
Yeah, well, there's two important things to know here. One is we have a constitution and constitutional protections. And that applies to non-citizens and immigrants as well as US citizens.
Hmm.
And so people should not feel like just because they are not US citizens that they have any less in the way of constitutional protections from government overreach and from abuse of power and authority by federal or local law enforcement agents. So that's thing number one to understand, is that people do have constitutional rights regardless of status. The second is, what measures of accountability are there for ICE agents and federal agents? And most people are familiar with, in the criminal justice system, in the legal system, if the police act in violation of the Constitution, say somebody's Fourth Amendment rights, whatever they recovered, contraband, illegal, drugs, guns, that gets suppressed, meaning it doesn't get to be used against the person in a criminal case. And the idea is, it's called the exclusionary rule. It's to deter police misconduct and unconstitutional behavior. That kind of safeguard that's in the criminal legal system doesn't exist in the immigration system, because the immigration system is a federal civil system. And so there's been a series of Supreme Court rulings that have basically excluded ICE and Border Patrol from the same kinds of constitutional safeguards that you see in the criminal legal system. That said, if a ICE officer violates your constitutional rights, comes into a private home or other private area without a warrant, or abuses somebody, beats them up, physically harms them, there are still protections under federal law, and folks should explore them. What we've seen is some states actually move to create more of a mechanism to hold ICE agents accountable. Illinois just passed some really great legislation that Governor Pritzker signed into law that basically gives residents a cause of action to sue ICE officers if they in fact violate their rights. So there are things that states can do, even though Supreme Court law and sort of like federal law in general is not as great and not as protective of people in terms of the immigration sort of like context as it is in the criminal justice context.
We're going to get into the Constitution and due process a little bit more in just a second, but I want to talk about the 60 Minutes CCOT segment that was pulled just last weekend. Just high level overview, what was your initial reaction to that story?
My initial reaction to the story of CBS pulling the story on CCOT, which became a story within a story, is I shouldn't be surprised, and yet I am, and disappointed to the extent that mainstream media will go to bury stories that feel inconvenient to this federal government because they don't want to get on the wrong side of them. And we have seen since the beginning of this second Trump presidency, we have watched law firms, mainstream media, corporations, the tech industry just fold to President Trump. And this felt like yet another example of that. And that's how it should be understood, sort of nothing more and nothing less. And then what is tragic about it is people who have seen the conditions at CCOT, which is this awful, awful mega prison, would say, well, that feels like un-American. How are we treating people like that? And what is important about that conversation is, well, we have a lot of those same human rights violations, abuses in American jails and prisons. This is not a uniquely sort of foreign problem. We are exporting, I suppose is the right word, exporting our human rights violations when it comes to jails and prisons elsewhere. But that doesn't mean that we let ourselves off the hook. And it's not just Trump and Republicans, but it's in fact true of Democratic administrations as well in this country. I live in New York. We have seen under Democratic governance huge violations of constitutional rights, death, abuse by prison guards of people who are incarcerated. Again, like there's a larger conversation to be had. And so for me, as somebody who's a criminal justice reform advocate, I was personally really disappointed that it was the CCOT story specifically that got buried, because there is such a mirror that is being held up there to what is happening, the abuses
Yeah.
and violations of basic human rights here in our own jails and prisons. But at the end of the day, I don't think that it was the CCOT prison that was the reason that the story got buried, but more because it would inflame or upset the Trump administration. If that exact same thing had happened under a Biden presidency, I promise you that story would have made it out.
Yeah, for sure. I the story itself was not shocking to me because it was information we knew, but now we had the visuals to back it up. But I loved what you just said about us just exporting our mass incarceration to a foreign place because, like in Alabama, I know we talked before we started recording a little bit about mass incarceration in Alabama, the documentary, The Alabama Solution. It is something that we are used to in this state. A small violation, like marijuana, is landing people life sentences in these prisons. People who are up for parole are still being denied parole because they're working for pennies on a dollar for the state to do things that they know they can't hire other people to do. So it's, again, advantageous for the state to keep these people in prison because it saves them money. Literally, it's about dollars. And so it's like America has mastered this idea and this concept of mass incarceration to the point where we are now able to export it to other places, ramp it up a little bit more in intensity, obviously, but now we can bring them to other places and see how that goes. And so again, wasn't shocking. It was more so shocking that, as you said, the lengths that they would go to bury a story, to protect it in administration that is just corrupt and unjust in so many ways. But I think the deeper thing to the CCOT story that did disturb me was the denial of due process for these individuals who were sent there. They were lied to about where they were going. They, again, no due process, and yet they were just sent to this place to get sexually, physically, mentally abused and tortured. And without that legal protection in place, when that's removed here in America, what kind of precedent is that setting for our future?
Chad, to your point that we are exporting the harms of mass incarceration elsewhere, and that's what CCOT sort of revealed. For folks who think, well, that feels like hyperbole or doesn't sound right to me, how could we do that in America? Folks should watch The Alabama Solution. It's on Netflix. It's an incredible documentary that literally is shown from the perspective of Alabama
Mhm.
prisoners who are taking footage from inside the Alabama prisons, and the conditions are as bad as what we saw in CCOT. They just are. So I just want to say that really explicitly for folks who think,
Sure.
how could that be in our country? It is, in fact, how our jails and prisons are often run as well. Now, in terms of due process, the lack of due process in this administration, in the immigration system, should be a cause of alarm for all of us. And again, it's this idea of what they are doing to immigrants and non-citizens is only going to sort of roll downhill to the rest of us soon enough and be used as justification. And how are we seeing due process just like run roughshod? Let me give you one really specific example.
Yes.
For decades in this country, in the immigration system, the idea was if you have a pending immigration case, there is due process, in that there is a court case, there will be hearings, there will be an adjudication. What we have seen under this administration is, both for people who have pending asylum claims as well as other kinds of immigration cases, this administration is literally just asking immigration judges to dismiss those cases, and suddenly people are left without any kind of due process or any kind of protection from immediate deportation. And the Trump administration is asking immigration judges to just dismiss their cases so that they can then summarily deport them. It's literally running roughshod over decades and decades of immigration sort of process and norms to basically say, here's how we're going to ramp up our deportation machine. The other thing we're seeing is the mass firing of immigration judges who have been tried to be a check on this administration's immigration due process violations. They're just getting fired. And we're not seeing any kind of accountability for that. We're not even seeing nearly enough sort of reporting in the news about this. But that is a huge problem because these judges are one of the few checks that we have on an immigration system that is literally like running wild. And then the third is that we've watched this federal administration cut off millions and millions of dollars that go towards immigration representation. So kids who are coming into this country unaccompanied and they are fleeing violence and corruption in their home countries, and who, under, again, decades of immigration law precedent, likely have a chance of staying here and winning their immigration case. Those 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds who don't speak the language, who certainly don't understand the immigration court process, are now being left to fend for themselves without a lawyer. Like, that is just crazy. And
Yeah.
again, for folks who are like, well, they're immigrants, why should we be spending all of this money? Well, first of all, we're all people, and those immigrant children and others could be any one of our kids.
Yeah.
So I know most people have a sense of like decency and humanity. And again, what we do to others is going to come back around and be done
Yeah.
to us. And so that check is really, really important. You can't say, well, that's just non-citizens, that's just immigrants, that's not us. That is, in fact, us. And that
Yeah.
lack of due process, lack of humanity is going to, again, roll downhill and impact all of us.
Yeah. But how we treat others says more about our values as a country. The way that we are willing to treat immigrants, the way that we are willing to treat people who are non-citizens, that says so much about how we are willing to treat people who are citizens. And
Yeah.
that is, I don't think there's a word to describe just how horrifying that is to me, for how
Yeah.
far they're willing to go to really just make life miserable for so many people. Because if they're willing to do it to them, there will be a point in time where they're willing to do it to us. If there's no checks, if there are no guardrails in place to stop them from what they're doing for these people, then
Yeah.
then what are the lengths that they're willing to go to do it to us?
Yeah. I think that
Like, we should all
is
care.
right. I was gonna go somewhere with that, which is a
Yeah.
more hopeful thought. The people who bought into the rhetoric of Democrats are looking out for them, they're not looking out for you. A year in, they're saying, well, Trump and the GOP isn't looking out for me either. And this is a real opportunity for either political party, but I'd say especially for Democrats, to think about a new paradigm here. And we started the conversation about how the status quo is simply not working, not on crime and public safety, not on immigration. People have very little faith in either party in their handling of these issues. Sure, Trump and the GOP gets a sort of like polling advantage, but it's only because they talk about the issue
Yeah.
more, not because they're doing anything about it. And so in 2026, we will see the issue of crime weaponized on the campaign trail as the midterms approach. And this is an opportunity for Democrats to stop being silent on the issue, to stop ceding ground, to stop going GOP light, and to actually adopt a new paradigm for safety. And that is going to be, I would say, a game changer in both, the political realm, but also as a matter of policy and reaching
Yeah.
people and saying, like, we are not going to let this administration use the guise of crime control to advance an authoritarian agenda. Democrats will stand up for what actually works to make our communities safe. And like, we are the ones who are strong on this, not the Trump administration. So I do want to say, like, I think everything that we are talking about and these excesses and this overreach and these violations, they open up an opportunity for Democrats should they seize it. And, this huge fight within the party of, do we sort of moderate or become more progressive, actually misses where voters are, which is voters across the political spectrum, we've seen from our polling, actually believe in this new paradigm, the one that we laid out sort of early on.
Yeah.
In this podcast, they actually don't think we need to get tough on crime. They don't.
Well, I want to say that keep it in the light of hope. You give me hope. The work that you're doing, the things that you are sharing with my audience, all this knowledge, the actions that we can take, everything that you are doing to further this message, that gives me hope for our future. And I'm really excited to see how Democrats respond with this opportunity messaging wise in 2026, because I feel like they're getting there. And I think having these conversations, the one that we're having today, can only help them to continue to get to that point where the messaging is on point. But we have reached the end of our conversation, and I ask all my guests in the final question what they're not wrong about. So I want to know now, what is it that you are not wrong about?
I'm not wrong that people are pissed and they're also energized. And we talked about that earlier on to
Yep.
say that is a potent combo. And I think that's really true. And we need to harness that energy for so much more good in 2026. And I feel hopeful we can.
I agree with you. You're not wrong about that. You just gave me the inspiration for the episode title for this one. So thank you for that. And listen, I appreciate your time with us today so much. The audience doesn't know this, but we had this conversation scheduled a few weeks ago, and I had to cancel it for reasons outside of my control. But the fact that you were so flexible with your time, you still came on and had this conversation with us. You're doing the important work. I cannot thank you enough for your time and everything that you are doing.
Oh, same, Chad. I am really grateful to you for having this conversation. It's not one we have enough. I hope it's one that we have more and more. And just really appreciate you speaking truth to power on the issues that matter to everyday people. I feel it, I see it, and I'm really grateful for it. So thank you.